welcome to Civilnet. My guest via Skype from Istanbul is Nazan Maksudyan. She's a professor at Istanbul Kemerburgaz University. Nazan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
You recently gave a lecture at the History Foundation's Thursday Talks, and it was entitled Three Generations, Three Massacres, 1895 to 1915, the Armenian Children and Orphans. You've also authored a number of books. You've looked at women, children, orphans in the late Ottoman Empire. You've written about racism. The most important or the most interesting thing that we oftentimes talk about are the orphans of the genocide of 1915, and yet we fail to remember the Hamidian Massacres that took place in the late 19th century and then the Adana Massacres. Are there similarities in the stories of those orphans, in your opinion?
Yeah, there are very strong similarities, I think, in these three generations that I talked about in my talk about Hamidian Massacres, Adana Massacres, and 1915. I think one of the biggest similarity is the uprooting of children. In the first case, most of these Armenian children were taken into the American orphanages, and most of them became Protestants. In the second case, in 1909, most of these orphans ended up in Cemal Pasha's Ottoman orphanage, and they were mostly raised in the Turkish language and without any religious education. So they became, according to his theory, Ottomans, but according to the critiques, the Armenian critics, they were Turkified. And in the 1915, we know that most of these children were adopted into households and they were Islamicized. So in all three cases, they risked, in a sense, losing their identities. This was one of the similarities. The other similarity is the interesting one that in all three cases, different parties were competing for these poor, sick, weak children, which is also, I think, very interesting. Why all these different groups, in the 1890s, you have missionaries, you have the government, you have, of course, the patriarchate fighting to, assume the responsibility of these orphans. And you have the same thing in 1909, and you have the same thing in the aftermath of the genocide. So this also, I think, is very interesting, why people were so willing to adopt or raise orphan Armenian children.
In your study, why do you think that was the case?
Partially the explanation is the population politics of the time. We know that population, the number of population was a huge wealth. People wanted to have more members of their societies, obviously, which is different from today. We don't have the same compassion towards Syrian orphans. But the other issue is that assimilation as a concept was very much accepted as a possibility. So people were thinking that they can actually recycle these Armenian children into Muslims or into Protestants or into whatever. So they think that identity was malleable. So it was also this kind of understanding that they can recycle children. But I think in the 20s already, 1920s already, identities were considered to be much more solid, and this possibility of change was not seen so obvious.
It is obvious, I think, for most people that in times of war, in times of massacres, that children are oftentimes the first victims. Now, of course, certainly we talk about them as orphans, but were children during those three very critical moments in Armenia's history, the Hamidian, the Adana, and then the genocide itself in 1915, were children actual targets, or were they, their victimization was because they became orphans because their parents were killed or died on the deportation routes?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think boys mostly, older than 13, 14, were targets because they were considered to be threats as their fathers. The children were not first-grade targets, but still we know that genocidal process was not only about killing, but also about reappropriation. So not only property, but children and women were reappropriated as part of the same process. So this is how they were also targeted, we may say. But we also have, from the Ottoman archives, for instance, have documents saying that you can adopt Armenian children or you can put them into state orphanages. But we don't have anything saying like, save the children, don't kill the children, you know, protect the children. This is not like, there's nothing about exactly or particularly saving them. So it's a complicated thing to say. I mean, we cannot really be sure if they were primary targets or they became victims because of what happened to their parents.
Right. Nazan, aside from your book, is there a body of academic research or study into the Armenian orphans from that time period today?
Well, today more and more people are working on survivors. I mean, survivors were analyzed in the diaspora for a very long time now, but survivors who were actually, I mean, survived because of their Islamicization are also very much studied today. So there are lots of studies on these Islamicized Armenians, but I think the difference of what I am doing is that I'm trying to focus on their experience as a child as well. So what I find interesting, for instance, is that how courageous they were, how unlikely things they did in all this process, like taking a train from Adana and going to Sivas to find their families. A 10-year-old that wouldn't do such a thing today, but at those times we have this like a different kind of child which is very active, taking action and controlling his or her life. This I find interesting. In that sense, from the perspective of the childhood studies, I don't think there is much written about this process, but in terms of oral history, in terms of recovering the lives of the survived children, we have work done.
Just before I ask my final question, I don't know, is there statistical data? Do we know about the numbers of children from those three particular time periods that were actually orphaned or were registered in different orphanages in the region?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, numbers, again, the biggest question and biggest problematic question. About the Hamidian massacres, people say about 200,000 to 300,000 people died. This is still discussed. American missionaries were saying about the orphans, at the time there were about 50,000 orphans, of which they took care of about 10,000. This is their statistics. We don't know, but if 200, 300 people died, then it's normal that 50,000 were orphaned. In the aftermath of Adana, we think 20,000 people died, and they left about 5,000 orphans. So it's like a quarter of the total number. People usually make such guesses. And so about 1915, again, this is a big discussion. Well, if you consider 1 million died, then it means that you have about 300,000 children orphaned by the process. But I cannot say that we have real documentation for all of this. I mean, in the Hamidian case, we have American sources. We know at least how many orphans attended their orphanages. And in Adana as well, we know how many orphanages were opened, what was the student body, etc. But about 1915, we know that many children ended up in different places without being properly registered. So it's hard to say, but I think it was something like 300,000.
It's quite a heartbreaking number and a heartbreaking story. Just as a final question, Nazan, we are now heading into the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide in 2015. And I know that Armenia, the Armenian diaspora, Armenians, the Armenian nation in general is preparing for that day. Tell me, if you will, in Turkey today, is there a growing number of Turkish academics or Turkish historians who are also studying the genocide or preparing for 2015?
I can't say there is a big interest in Turkey about the issue. 1915 in Turkey mostly remember as the anniversary of the Gallipoli campaign. So this is what is more interesting for many, many historians. Of course, the new generation is, if not entirely focusing on the Armenian genocide, they know about it, they make it a part of their research if necessary, etc. But I think the growth of interest is not so promising.
Well, Nazan, thank you for your perspective and thank you for the work that you are doing and for the studies that you've done looking at the fate, the lives of Armenian orphans during those 3 massacres. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me again.
And I'd like to remind our viewers that my guest via Skype from Istanbul was Nazan Maksudyan of the Istanbul Kemerburgaz University. Stay with Civilnet.